Just before we move on to the next question, I do want to make one little addition to our discussion about this question: have you ever shared the gospel with an unsaved person? I've added three additional questions that I think would help to clarify the answer to this. And you can think this through. And again, feel free to respond to me, send an email or a text, or if you have any comments or feedback about this. Number one, with whom did you share the gospel? Was it a child? Was it a friend? Was it a workmate? Was it somebody you go to school with? Was it a sibling? Those types of things would be interesting to know as well. How'd you get the opportunity to share it? Is that something you had to go after? Or did somebody ask of you a reason of the hope that is in you, as Peter says, and because they saw a difference in your life, and so you had a chance to answer the question as a result of that? How did it go? That's a really good question. Did they show interest? Did they kind of stiff arm you at that point? Were there further opportunities after that to follow up with more questions? So these are just a few questions that can kind of help to shed some light on the question of whether or not you've had a chance to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So again, I would be happy to interact with you if you had a question, or if you'd like to share an opportunity with me that God has given to you. It'd be great to hear from you about that. All right, let's go to question number 5. Have you ever personally led someone to Christ? As you know, it's one thing to say I've had opportunities to witness. It's another thing to say I have actually led people to faith in Jesus Christ. So here's how the answers typically look. 72 said, no, I've never had that opportunity, despite the fact that I may have been able to witness. And 38 said, yes, I have been able to lead someone to Christ. Now, let's just talk turkey about this. First of all, probably as a general rule, we could say that more often than not, when you're sharing the gospel of Christ, people will reject it. Okay? I'm not sure I've ever met a Christian who has been involved in evangelism for any period of time who would say, yes, most of the people I've witnessed to have actually come to Christ. The Bible tells us that narrow is the way that leads to life, and the wide road is the one that most people are going to follow. Remember that even the nation of Israel, which will be redeemed at the end, is limited to a third of those who are alive during the tribulation. That will be the remnant. So if you've struggled with that to actually lead someone to Christ, then it's not necessarily because you're doing something wrong. Let me say this as well. Many people get discouraged when they don't see more fruit. We Westerners tend to love our statistics, and when we talk about percentages, we want to be on the positive side of the numbers. And if you have an opportunity to share Christ with 10 different people over a period of time, and only one of them, trusts Christ, or maybe none of them, you look at those statistics and you say, I'm a failure. I want to be careful about this next statement, but I am going to make it because I think there is validity. God seems to have gifted some people with a greater ability to actually lead people they witness to Christ. Other people, though they're just as faithful and prayerful and hardworking, just don't seem to have the ability to reap the same harvest. Now, we know that God is the one that has to work in the heart. We've made that clear. That's the sovereignty of God section that we've talked about so often. But I have met people that just seem to have a God-given facility to lead people to Christ. And when I hear about what they share with them, it's the same thing I share with people. Okay? Are they praying harder than I am? I have no way of knowing that. But just because somebody else may seem to have a greater facility of leading folks to Christ than you do doesn't mean that you might as well give up, or you're doing something wrong, you're living in sin or something like that. Because that's the type of thing we're tempted to think when we compare ourselves to others. I could give you the names of a few individuals right now whom I know who are incredibly gifted at soul winning. And man, they just, I mean, there's the stories they tell are impressive. And I sit back thinking, wow, that's amazing. I've never experienced that in my life. And at times I've been tempted to get discouraged and say, I'm just going to forget it because that's not my area. I'll let somebody else handle that. Well, I don't think that's the right answer either. Okay. When you stand before the Lord Jesus someday, you're going to be evaluated not on the basis of, your percentages or the sheer number of people you've led to Christ. You're going to be evaluated by the Lord Jesus based on your faithfulness to the task he gave you to do. And even though I don't believe that there is a spiritual gift listed in the Bible that's called evangelism, I do believe, as I mentioned earlier, that God seems to have facilitated conversion decisions in the hearts of certain people. He's gifted people with a greater ability to do that. And why that's the case, I don't know. But God is sovereign in that, and we just have to leave that to him. But it in no way excuses us from being faithful. All right. Again, there are some questions that we can ask in conjunction to this. What kind of person did you lead to Christ? Was it a sibling, a camper, a child, co-worker, etc.? Same question I asked with regard to, who you had a chance to witness to. Was this part of a church outreach program? Now, let me just say this. I think we need to be very careful as believers that we don't relegate the responsibility for evangelism to church programming. I am in no way opposed to evangelism programs in churches. Maybe a Thursday night visitation night when people go out knocking on doors, or maybe some sort of evangelism training program where you're taking people out and encouraging them to share Christ. An Awana ministry or some other ministry like that where children are coming in and hearing the gospel. I am not opposed to those types of ministries. God has greatly used them. I think the mistake that so many believers have made, however, is just assuming that the church's job is to evangelize. And, that's not for me. Or if I have a responsibility, it's just to invite people to church. And if I invite somebody to come to church and they come, I've done my part. If they don't come, it's not my fault. And I really believe that by adopting that attitude, we have neglected the personal responsibility that God has given to each of us. And the fact is, some believers have more contacts also than other believers do. I work in a Christian environment, and I go to my church, and I have a Christian family, okay? And so my contact with unbelievers on a regular day-by-day basis is much more limited than in the case of, for example, a couple of my children who work alongside unsaved people more regularly. And that doesn't in any way excuse me, but it means that I need to be more intentional, perhaps, and prayerful about open doors of opportunity to share the gospel of Christ. Was this person from an unchurched background? Well, that's a very good question. In other words, did this person have previous exposure to the gospel? And sometimes what you are doing when you lead someone to Christ is simply reaping a harvest that somebody else has sown and watered. Remember that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, one plants and one waters, but God is the one that gives the increase. And so even if you have not had the opportunity to lead that particular person to Christ and someone else did, perhaps God used you along the way somehow to plant or water the seed. Don't ever forget that. I firmly believe that when we stand before the Lord Jesus Christ someday to give an account, we are going to be amazed at the ways that he used us that we never could have understood or recognized in this life. I really believe that. I say that to encourage you. Sometimes you think, well, when I stand before Jesus, there's not going to be a whole lot there. It's going to be pretty much, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you weren't faithful here, you missed the boat there, And there may be some of that. But I believe we'll be amazed at ways that God used us to contribute to the salvation of and encouragement of people in this life that we would never have thought of right now in the course of this life. And so I encourage you to be faithful and just trust God to use you, whether the way He's using you is obvious right now or not. Were you the first one ever to share the gospel with this person? That kind of goes along with that previous question. Maybe you're the seed planter, and if that person doesn't trust Christ today, maybe they will in the future because of something that started with you. And even if they never do, again, it's faithfulness to the Lord's command that's most important here, not whether or not the individual trusted Christ. All right. Question number 6. Do you ever struggle with guilt for not being a more faithful witness? And you can see the answer options: no, or yes occasionally, or yes often. I was especially intrigued by this question and anticipating the answers of my students, and this is how it has turned out. Most have confessed that yes, at times they've wrestled with guilt for not being more faithful in sharing the gospel. A good number said, I deal with this on a regular basis. This is something that has bothered me many times. And very few have said, no, I never deal with that. So now what I've done is I've expanded question number 6, and I've asked, why the struggle? What's going on? When you do feel guilty, what is provoking that guilty feeling? Do you feel guilty because you're not being obedient to God's command to witness, or because someone else is outshining you as a witness for Christ? I want you to notice the importance of those two questions. The first question has to do with my relationship to God. Am I feeling guilty because I know that I have not been faithful to my Lord? Or is this a peer pressure thing, where I'm looking at others around me and saying, I'm not doing as well as so-and-so is, and therefore I feel guilty? That kind of guilt I would call a false or unbiblical guilt. When we feel guilty about our service to God because we're not doing as well as, somebody else, then, we're committing not only the sin of neglect, but also the sin of comparing ourselves with others. Our standard is the Lord Jesus Christ and not what somebody else is doing. Now, other people can be examples and they can encourage us, but in the final analysis, it's not how well I did compared to somebody else. It's, am I being faithful to the Lord Jesus Christ? So, question number 7 then really kind of rides on the heels of question 6. What is your greatest challenge in witnessing? And I want to spend a little more time on these questions. You can see the options here. How do you get started? Not knowing how to explain the gospel, being rejected or criticized, not living as a faithful witness should live, a lack of burden for lost people, or not having any unsaved friends. And so this is how that question was answered. And we're going to spend the next few sessions going into this question a little more deeply. Notice that the biggest reason given was I don't know how to get started. I just have trouble really launching a presentation of the gospel. And then the second most popular response was, I'm afraid of rejection. If I share the gospel, they may not only reject the gospel, but they may reject me as a person. I may lose my friendship and further opportunities to be a witness. And then you see some say, I don't have any friends who are unsaved, or, my life isn't really reflecting the love and character of Christ in a way that, should convince people they need him. And then some have been honest enough to say, I just don't have a burden for the lost. It's something I've just struggled with. So we are going to take the next a few sessions and open these up a little bit more and give some detail and perhaps offer some suggestions.